Good morning, elves. At least you got to meet elves yesterday and you chose an elf name from the elf generator that I put out. And hopefully that chapter was fairly understandable. You met some new characters, and I just wanted to talk today about two things that may help increase your understanding of the book and why Tolkien wrote it. So, the first thing I want to talk about is for those of you who have watched the movie, that's awesome. I have no problems with you watching the movie, but I do want to tell you something so that you are not confused today. So, if you've seen The Fellowship of the Ring that Peter Jackson directed, basically when he first started directing those movies, his budget was large, but it was not as large as what he had for The Hobbit. So, The Fellowship of the Ring, the whole Lord of the Rings series took off like he did not expect. And after that, he was able to get a great deal of funding and a higher budget for The Hobbit and publish The Hobbit, or produce The Hobbit rather, in three different installments. Whereas The Hobbit is actually even shorter than The Fellowship of the Ring. So it would have been nice if he could have done something like that for The Lord of the Rings and actually made 6 movies as opposed to just 3, or something longer where he could put more of the story into it. So if you've watched the movie The Fellowship of the Ring, something important to note today. Up to this point, the movie pretty much has followed the book from what we've read so far. But when you get to today's chapter, which is a shortcut to mushrooms, there is a nod to this, but one of the main characters in this chapter is just basically a silhouette in the movie, and you don't really get to see them. And also, they did change the plot line a little bit, whereas Pippin had more interaction with this character, or was kind of the culprit, and indeed, it was actually Frodo that had a problem with this character in the past before. So the movie changes some things there. And then after that, pretty much after chapter 4, it goes straight from chapter 4 to chapter 9 in the book. So chapters 5, 6, 7, 8 are pretty much entirely left out of the movie. All the characters that we meet there are left out. You probably already noticed that Gildor, the elf that we met yesterday, he was not in the movie. He doesn't appear in the movies. So be aware that there are going to be some changes, and Peter Jackson, in order to meet the time crunch, in order to meet the budget crunch, he cut out actors and actresses that would have been characters that have been portrayed in here, and he cut out some of the events. So essentially 5 chapters of the book, poof, gone. So you're going to read about things that were not in the movie if you've seen it. So just to clarify so none of you are confused about that. Second thing, many of you had asked me questions about Tolkien's life when we were talking about the prologue last week. And I held off on answering those because I wanted to try to apply them to the book and help you to understand his motivation behind writing what he did. So today's chapters that you're reading, A Shortcut to Mushrooms and A Conspiracy Unmasked, have a lot to do with friendship. And you're going to see that friendship is a key element throughout his novels. And you might be thinking, well, why is friendship so important to J.R.R. Tolkien? And the roots of that really lie in his personal life. So I wanted to answer some of those questions that you had about his personal life. So I'm going to start with what was his life like when he was younger. And Haley and Ian, I believe you had asked me questions about this or like this. And so I wanted to address that first because maybe understanding his background will help you to understand why friendship is so important. So he lived in South Africa until he was 3 years old with his mother and his father. His father was a banker in Bloemfontein, South Africa. His father unfortunately passed away when Tolkien was 3, and his father died from rheumatic fever. His father and mother were both expatriates from England, so they had originally lived in England, went to South Africa for work, and then when his mother became a widow, she also had another son who was younger than Tolkien. She took them back to England, but she had converted to Catholicism, so she was Protestant, and she changed religions to become Catholic. And when she got back, her family and Tolkien's family were both staunch Protestants, and they basically rejected her and didn't help her or Tolkien and his brother at all. So she's pretty much on her own. And luckily for them, their pastor, whose name was Father Francis, actually helped her and helped make sure that the boys were cared for. And she did fairly well on her own, and she was a very intelligent woman. And as we know from the time of Hattie Big Sky, when we were reading about that, it was not common for women to finish schooling or to go on and get further schooling, because most of what women were supposed to do is they were supposed to be at home and raise the children and cook and clean, and that was it. Tolkien was very fortunate in the sense that his mother was very educated, and so she was able to provide some homeschooling for them because she couldn't afford to send them to school. So again, if you think back to when we talked about Andrew Carnegie, in England, a lot of times only the wealthy could get an education. There wasn't free public education for all, at least not yet at this time. So because of that, she was able to tutor them in German, Latin, and French. So she was able to do those 3 languages with them. In addition, she provided them with a wealth of literature, and a lot of that literature had to do with fairy tales or legends of King Arthur or legends that had to do with dragons. And so that's kind of where his idea for The Hobbit came from, is from reading all those fairy tales when he was younger. Important note about languages too. Tolkien was a genius when it came to language. He knew so many languages. So he was fluent in German, French, Latin. He went on in college and learned more. So he knew Gothic, he knew Finnish, he knew some Danish. I mean, the list goes on. Middle English as well, so he could read old poetry like Beowulf in its original language. So he was well versed in that. And you're going to see too that the elves have their own language, and Tolkien actually developed Sindarin and Quenya, which are 2 languages that he created just from his own brain and his own mind and knowledge of other languages. And you can actually learn Sindarin and Quenya if you want. I have not. I can't speak either. But there are manuals out there. There are reverse dictionaries out there that if you wanted to speak in Elvish, you could. It's possible. And some of the actors and actresses that played elves in the movies learned portions of Quenya or Sindarin in order to speak that in the movies. All right, so another tragedy hits Tolkien when he's young. His mother actually passes away too. She was diabetic. They did not know exactly how to treat diabetic people. They didn't have available insulin for them, and so she passed away from that. Now, Tolkien and his brother are now orphans. And you might remember that Frodo is an orphan. So he has that in common with Frodo. He knows what that is like. In fact, we also read about Hattie Big Sky. Hattie was an orphan too. Now, she wasn't a real person, nor is Frodo, but Tolkien has that in common with Frodo and Hattie. Now, Father Francis took care of Tolkien and his brother for basically the rest of their childhood years. And Father Francis made sure that Tolkien received an education, and he actually had a good education. He had a private education. And this is where friendship starts to come into play. Tolkien formed a very close bond with 3 other male students at that school, and they were all interested in literary movements. So one was interested in poetry, one was interested in art. They were all interested in theater and storytelling. Tolkien, obviously, the most interested in storytelling. That was his passion. And so they formed this creative club that they called the Tea Club Bavarian Society. And they met a couple times a week at one of their favorite local shops. It was a bookstore and kind of a cafe, as you might say, kind of like a Barnes and Noble almost. And they would meet there, they would share their ideas and just have fun and, get along. They also played rugby. Somebody had asked, I think it was Sam had asked, was he athletic? Yes, he played rugby. I mean, he wasn't like a professional athlete, but yes, he was athletic. So they all had this in common. And then one other thing that they had in common is eventually when they went off to college and Tolkien went to Oxford and they followed too, World War I broke out while they were going to college there. And at first, they were not enlisted or drafted, but remember, this is in England, not in the United States. And eventually, they did go to war, all 4 of them. Only 2 of them survived. Tolkien survived, kind of by a stroke of fate. I have a quote here for a second, and I'll read it to you. But the other 2 did not. So he lost 2 of his best friends. And this might be a portion of why friendship is so important in The Lord of the Rings when you're reading that. And you're going to see that as a theme throughout, and being loyal and doing anything to help another friend survive. Because in war, that's what it was about. It was helping your comrades survive and trying to protect everyone. And unfortunately, he went through the death of 2 of his very close friends. So Tolkien survived. You might be wondering how. I have a quote from a Smithsonian Magazine article that I've been using for quite a few years that was put out. It has a lot of good information in it. It says, if there's any defining experience behind The Lord of the Rings, it was more likely Tolkien's witnessing of the horrors of the front during World War I. And just a side note here too, World War I was considered one of the first modern wars because at this point before, people had not seen machine guns, tanks, airplanes, air raids. That was all new in warfare. And so it was terrifying, obviously. And you know, that was horrific. And so a lot of the things that you're going to see happen in the Fellowship of the Ring, and if you continue to read on and you actually read the rest of the Lord of the Rings, I would love for you to do that. They're great books. You'll see more of that horrifying aspect of not knowing what's coming at you, and there are these other beings with powers that you've never seen before, sort of like other armies that you've never seen before with powers that they have. And so we might make that parallel between World War One and what he went through, and the horrors and the scary monsters, creatures that they come across in the Fellowship of the Ring, like the Black Riders. It says, as a 24-year out of Oxford, he had taken part in the Battle of Somme in 1916, where he had fallen ill with trench fever and was removed from action long enough to spare his life. So luckily he survived, so it's not really lucky that he got trench fever, but because he was so ill on the battlefield, he was brought back, and he was actually cared for by his wife, Edith Bratt, Edith Tolkien then, and he was able to avoid that, and the war ended shortly after, so he didn't actually go back to battle when he recovered because the war was over. So he lucked out in that sense, but his other two friends passed away, did not. So I think that might be partially why you see Tolkien have this strong sense of friendship and doing whatever you can to protect your friends. And you're going to see that with some of the characters today, like Sam and Merry and Pippin. If you've already read this before you saw this video, that's fine too, but you're going to see that in the book. Okay, so I have more answers to some of your questions, which I'll share later, but I want to keep my video short since you do have 2 chapters to read today, and I hope you enjoy it. Feel free to contact me with questions, and have a lovely day, everybody.